The blood on Abigail Turner's hands was still warm as the town council gathered in the church, their faces like stone beneath the flickering lantern light. She'd never seen such hatred in the eyes of people. She'd known her whole life people who'd once greeted her with kind smiles on Sunday mornings now looked at her as if she were the devil himself. But Abigail wouldn't take back what she'd done, not even as the mayor banged his gavel against the pulpit. "Caldwell has rules, Miss Turner," Mayor Wilson declared, his voice echoing through the packed church in central Wyoming territory. "Rules that have kept us alive since 1868, and rules you knowingly broke tonight." Abigail stood tall, despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. At 22, she'd already spent 4 years as the town's only nurse after her father passed, and tonight had been no different from any other night she'd tended to the sick and wounded. Except that tonight, the man bleeding on her doorstep had been an outlaw. "He was dying," she said simply. "I took an oath to help decent folk," Sheriff Mills bellowed from his seat in the front row. "Not to stitch up the likes of Joe Blackwater. That man's killed 3 lawmen across 2 territories." "I didn't ask his name or his crimes," Abigail replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I saw a man with a bullet in his shoulder and another grazing his side. I treated him as I would treat any of you, Mrs." Donovan, the baker's wife who had once taught Abigail her letters, rose to her feet. "And where is he now, Abigail? Did you send him on his merry way to kill again?" "I treated him and sent him on his way," she answered truthfully. "Where he goes and what he does is between him and God." The crowd erupted in angry shouts and accusations. Mayor Wilson banged his gavel repeatedly until the noise subsided. "The vote has been cast," he announced solemnly. "Abigail Turner, for aiding a known criminal and endangering the good people of Caldwell, you are hereby banished from our town. You have until dawn to gather your belongings and leave. Should you return, you will be treated as the criminals you so willingly aid." The words hit her like physical blows. Banished from the only home she'd ever known, from her father's grave, from everything familiar and safe. "You can't be serious," she whispered. "Where am I supposed to go?" "That's no longer Caldwell's concern," Sheriff Mills said coldly. Abigail looked desperately around the room, searching for a friendly face, for someone to speak up in her defense. But eyes dropped away from hers one by one. "This is not justice," she said, her voice breaking. "This is fear." "This meeting is adjourned," Mayor Wilson declared, ignoring her words. The townsfolk began filing out, whispering among themselves, some casting pitying glances her way, but none brave enough to stand beside her. Abigail remained frozen in place as the church emptied, until only she and Reverend Thomas remained. "I'm sorry, child," the elderly reverend said softly. "Perhaps in time they'll see reason." "And until then?" Abigail asked, tears finally spilling over. "What am I to do until then?" The reverend had no answer for her. By midnight, Abigail had packed what she could into her father's old wagon. Her medical supplies, some clothing, the few books she treasured, and the small box containing her mother's wedding ring and her father's pocket watch. Everything else the house she grew up in, the garden she'd tended, the life she'd built she was forced to leave behind. As she hitched her aging mare to the wagon, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her turn. A lone rider approached through the darkness, his silhouette growing clearer in the moonlight. Abigail reached for the rifle she'd placed nearby, her heart pounding with fear. "No need for that," a deep voice called out. "I mean you no harm, Miss Turner." The rider came into view, a tall man with broad shoulders, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He guided his horse to a stop several paces away, keeping his hands visible. "How do you know my name?" she demanded, the rifle still raised. "Heard what happened in town," he replied. "Word travels fast, especially when it's about someone being treated unjustly. And who are you to concern yourself with justice?" She didn't lower the rifle. The man removed his hat, revealing a handsome face with days-old stubble and eyes that appeared almost silver in the moonlight. "Name's Henry Stone. I was passing through when I overheard talk at the saloon about what they did to you." Abigail studied him carefully. His clothes were worn but clean denim pants, a cotton shirt beneath a leather vest, and boots that had seen many miles. A gun belt hung at his hip, well used but well cared for. He had the look of a man who knew how to handle himself in rough country. "And what business is it of yours, Mr. Stone? I reckon a woman alone on the trail is asking for trouble these days," he said. "Especially one who's just made enemies of her hometown. I can take care of myself," Abigail replied, though even she heard the uncertainty in her voice. Henry dismounted smoothly, keeping a respectful distance. "I don't doubt that, Miss Turner. But there's safety in numbers, and I'm headed north toward the Montana Territory. If you've no particular destination in mind, I'd be honored to ride alongside you for a spell." Abigail finally lowered the rifle, fatigue overwhelming her caution. "Why would you help a stranger?" "For all you know, I might deserve what they did to me." Henry's mouth curved into a half smile. "I know enough about small towns to know they sometimes get things wrong, and I know enough about people to recognize when someone's been wronged." He paused. "Besides, anyone who risks everything to save a life has my respect, no matter whose life it was." Abigail felt a strange flutter in her chest at his words, the first kind ones she'd heard since the nightmare began. Still, she wasn't raised to be foolish. "What's in it for you, Mr. Stone?" "Like I said, company on the trail, and perhaps—" He hesitated. "Perhaps the services of a skilled healer should the need arise. I've got a bullet in my leg that never quite healed right." Abigail's medical instincts instantly awakened. "How long ago is their infection?" Henry chuckled. "Going on 2 years now, and no, it's mostly just pain when the weather changes, but it speaks to the value of having someone with your skills nearby." She considered him for a long moment. He didn't have the look of an outlaw, but neither did he seem like an ordinary settler. There was something in his eyes, something that spoke of experiences beyond what most men his age had seen. "I'll ride with you as far as the next town," she finally decided. "After that, we'll see." "Fair enough." Henry nodded, then glanced at her loaded wagon. "Need help with anything else before we head out?" Abigail looked back at the small house that had been her home for all her 22 years. In the darkness, she could almost pretend that things were normal, that come morning, she'd be treating Mrs. Peterson's rheumatism or delivering the Cooper baby, but that life was gone now, as surely as if it had burned to the ground. "No," she said quietly, "I have everything I need." As the first hint of dawn colored the eastern sky, Abigail Turner and Henry Stone rode away from Caldwell, Wyoming Territory. Neither looked back at the town that slumbered behind them, unaware that this night marked not just an ending, but the beginning of something neither could yet imagine. They traveled in companionable silence as the sun rose fully above the horizon, painting the landscape in gold and amber. The Wyoming countryside spread before them, rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and the distant purple shadows of mountains. Despite her exhaustion, Abigail found herself studying her unexpected traveling companion. Henry Stone rode with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. He sat tall and alert, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Occasionally, he would adjust his position, and she noticed the slight grimace that crossed his face when he put weight on his right leg, the one with the bullet. She presumed. "How far to the next town?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Coopersville is about 2 days' ride," Henry replied. "Small place, but they've got a decent inn where you could rest properly." Abigail nodded. Sleep pulled at her eyelids, but she fought it. "And where are you headed ultimately?" Henry was quiet for a moment. "There's a ranch near Helena that's hiring hands. Owner's an old friend of my father's." "You're a ranch hand, then?" A smile touched his lips. "Among other things, I've driven cattle, broken horses, panned for gold, even tried my hand at trapping for a season." He glanced her way. "What about you?" "Always been a healer. My father was the doctor in Caldwell," Abigail explained. "He taught me everything he knew. When he passed, there was no one else, so I just continued his work." She swallowed hard. "Until last night." Henry's expression darkened. "Tell me what happened, if you don't mind." Abigail sighed, the memory still raw. "It was after midnight. I was preparing medicines for morning when there was pounding at my door. When I opened it, a man collapsed on my doorstep, bleeding badly from 2 gunshot wounds. "Joe Blackwater," Henry said. She nodded. "I didn't know who he was then. I just saw a man who would die without help." I got him inside, removed the bullet from his shoulder, and stitched the graze on his side. She paused. He was barely conscious, but he thanked me before he left, said I was the first person to show him kindness in years. Then what happened? Sheriff Mills arrived with his deputies about an hour later, tracking blood from my doorstep. When they realized I'd treated Blackwater and let him go, they dragged me before the town council. Abigail's voice hardened. "The same people whose children I've delivered, whose bones I've set, whose fevers I've treated, they voted to cast me out without a second thought." Henry was quiet for a long moment. People fear what they don't understand, and they don't understand how someone could help a man they see as evil. "I don't believe any man is beyond redemption," Abigail said firmly, "and I certainly don't believe in letting someone die when I have the power to help." "A rare view in these parts," Henry remarked. "Most folks out here believe in an eye for an eye, and where do you stand, Mr. Stone?" His silver-blue eyes met hers. "I believe the world has enough death in it without adding more unnecessarily." Something in his gaze suggested he knew more about death than he cared to share. They fell silent again as the morning progressed, stopping briefly at midday to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of jerky and hardtack that Henry produced from his saddlebags. As they prepared to continue, Abigail noticed Henry wincing as he mounted his horse. "Your leg is troubling you," she observed. "We should make camp early tonight so I can examine it properly." Henry looked as if he might protest, then nodded. "Much obliged, Miss Turner." "Abigail," she corrected him. "If we're to travel together, even temporarily, you might as well use my given name." "Abigail," he repeated, and something about the way he said it made her cheeks warm. "Then you must call me Henry." By late afternoon, they'd reached a small creek lined with cottonwood trees, a good spot to make camp with water, shelter, and enough visibility to see anyone approaching. Henry helped Abigail down from the wagon, his strong hands steadying her waist for just a moment before he stepped away. "I'll see to the horses," he offered, "if you'd like to get a fire started." They worked efficiently together, as if they'd done this many times before. Soon a small fire crackled cheerfully, the horses were grazing contentedly, and Henry had produced a rabbit he'd shot along the way, which now roasted on a spit over the flames. "Now," Abigail said once they'd eaten, "let me see that leg." Henry hesitated, then rolled up his right pant leg to reveal a puckered scar just above his knee. The area around it was slightly discolored, and Abigail could see that the bullet had torn through muscle before exiting. "Who treated this?" she asked, professional interest overriding any concern about propriety as she knelt to examine the wound more closely. "Army surgeon initially," Henry replied. "Then I took care of it myself after I was discharged." Abigail's eyes shot up to his face. "You were a soldier," Henry nodded. "Union Army, enlisted in '62 when I was 18, fought until the end in '65. "The war's been over for 6 years, Abigail noted. "This wound looks more recent." A shadow crossed Henry's face. "Different fight. This one I got 3 years back near the Smoky Hill Trail. Freight wagon I was guarding got ambushed." Abigail gently probed the scar tissue, feeling the damaged muscle beneath. "The bullet's gone, but it didn't heal properly. There's scar tissue pressing on the nerve, which is why you feel pain. Can anything be done about it?" She sat back on her heels, thinking. "With the right tools, yes, I could reopen the wound, clean out the scar tissue, and stitch it properly. But I'd need my surgical kit, clean water, whiskey for disinfection, and at least a week of rest afterward." "Not exactly trail medicine, then," Henry said with a rueful smile. "No," Abigail admitted. "But once we reach a town, I could perform the procedure if you're willing, for now." She rummaged in her bag and produced a small tin. "This salve will help with the inflammation. And I can show you exercises to strengthen the muscle around it." As she applied the salve to his leg, Abigail was acutely aware of his eyes on her, watching her work with a mixture of curiosity and something else she couldn't quite name. Her fingers moved gently over the damaged flesh, and she felt him tense slightly at her touch. "Sorry," she murmured. Did that hurt? No, Henry replied, his voice oddly rough. It's just been a while since anyone tended to me like this. Abigail finished her ministrations and sat back. There. That should provide some relief, at least temporarily. Thank you. Henry rolled his pant leg down. It does feel better already. Night had fallen completely now, the fire casting dancing shadows across their small camp. Above them, stars punched holes in the black canopy of sky, more numerous than Abigail had ever noticed when surrounded by the lights of town. It's beautiful out here, she said softly, looking upward. I've never been this far from home before. The open country has its own kind of magic, Henry agreed, though it can be unforgiving to those who don't respect it. Is that why you offered to travel with me? You thought I wouldn't respect the wilderness? Henry smiled. No. I offered because a woman with the courage to stand by her convictions, even at great personal cost, deserved better than to face the consequences alone. His words warmed her more than the fire. For a moment, their eyes held across the flames, and Abigail felt something shift between them, a connection forming where there had been only cautious alliance before. The moment was broken by the distant howl of a wolf. Henry immediately reached for his rifle, his expression turning serious. Get some sleep, he said. I'll take first watch. Wake me in a few hours, Abigail insisted. You need rest too, especially with that leg. Henry looked as if he might argue, then nodded. 4 hours, then I'll wake you. Abigail made a bed from her blankets in the back of the wagon and lay down, watching as Henry positioned himself against a tree trunk, rifle across his lap, his profile sharp against the firelight. Despite her exhaustion, sleep was elusive as her mind replayed the events that had led her here. She wondered what her father would have thought of her actions. Dr. James Turner had been a man of principle who believed in helping any soul in need, regardless of their station or reputation. He would have understood her decision to treat Joe Blackwater, she was certain. But would he have approved of her current situation alone in the wilderness with a man she barely knew? Abigail glanced again at Henry's silhouette. There was something solid about him, something trustworthy despite the hints of a troubled past. She'd always prided herself on being a good judge of character, and everything in her said Henry Stone was a good man. With that thought comforting her, Abigail finally drifted into a dreamless sleep, the gentle sounds of the wilderness a strange lullaby around her. She woke to Henry's gentle touch on her shoulder and the pre-dawn chill in the air. Your watch, he said softly. Everything's been quiet. Abigail nodded, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Thank you, get some rest now. As Henry settled into his bedroll, Abigail added wood to the fire and poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot he'd left warming. The hot liquid helped chase away the morning cold as she kept vigil over their small camp. In the quiet darkness before dawn, with only the soft sounds of Henry's breathing and the occasional rustle of nighttime creatures, Abigail allowed herself to truly feel the weight of what had happened. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks as she mourned the life she'd lost and faced the uncertain future ahead. By the time the first rays of sun painted the eastern sky, she had dried her tears and made her decision. She would not let Caldwell's rejection define her. Whatever came next, she would face it with courage and conviction, the same qualities that had led her to help a wounded outlaw. Consequences be damned. As if sensing her resolve, Henry stirred and sat up, his hair tousled from sleep. Their eyes met across the dying fire, and in that moment, Abigail knew that whatever path lay ahead, she was grateful not to be walking it alone. Their second day of travel proved more challenging than the first. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon by mid-morning, and by noon, rain poured from the sky in sheets, turning the trail to mud and slowing their progress considerably. There's an old line shack about 3 miles ahead, Henry shouted over the downpour. Used by cattle drivers during roundup. We can wait out the worst of it there. Abigail nodded, too wet and miserable to speak. Her dress was soaked through, clinging uncomfortably to her skin, and her hair had escaped its pins to hang in sodden ropes around her face. The wagon wheels kept sinking into muddy ruts, requiring both of them to push it free more than once. By the time the small wooden structure came into view, Abigail was shivering uncontrollably. The lined shack was little more than a one-room cabin with a small lean-to for horses, but it might as well have been a palace to her rain-drenched eyes. Henry helped her down from the wagon, practically lifting her when her numb legs refused to cooperate. "Let's get you inside and warmed up," he said, concern evident in his voice. The interior of the shack was basic but dry: a small iron stove in one corner, a narrow cot against one wall, a rough wooden table with a single chair, and shelves holding a few basic supplies left by previous occupants. Henry immediately set to work building a fire in the stove while Abigail stood dripping on the dirt floor. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," Henry said matter-of-factly. "I'll tend to the horses and bring in our supplies. That should give you privacy to change." Abigail nodded gratefully, teeth chattering too hard for speech. Once Henry had gone back outside, she peeled off her sodden dress and petticoats with numbed fingers, wrapping herself in the relatively dry blanket from her medical bag. Her spare clothing was in her trunk, which was hopefully still dry in the covered wagon. When Henry returned, arms laden with supplies, he kept his eyes carefully averted. "I've brought your trunk. It stayed mostly dry under the canvas." He set it down near her. "I'll step outside again while you change. And no," Abigail managed through chattering teeth, "you're as wet as I am. Light the stove, then turn your back. We both need to get warm." Henry hesitated, then nodded. Once the fire was crackling in the small stove, he turned to face the wall. "I won't look." Abigail quickly found her spare dress and undergarments, changing as rapidly as her cold fingers would allow. "I'm decent now," she announced. "Your turn." They worked out an awkward system, with Abigail facing the wall while Henry changed into dry clothes. Soon they were both huddled near the stove, hands extended toward the blessed heat. "Thank you for knowing about this place," Abigail said, feeling warmth gradually return to her extremities. "I don't think I could have gone much further in that downpour." "I've spent enough time in these parts to know where the shelters are," Henry replied, running a hand through his damp hair. "This storm looks set to last through the night. We'll have to stay here until morning." Abigail glanced around the small cabin. One cot barely wide enough for a single person. As if reading her thoughts, Henry quickly added, "You take the cot, I'll make a pallet on the floor." "You're injured," she protested. "You should take the cot." "I've slept in worse places than a wooden floor, Abigail," he said with a small smile. "Far worse." The way he said it made her wonder again about his past. There was clearly more to Henry Stone than he'd revealed so far. As the afternoon wore on, the rain continued to pound on the roof of the small cabin. Henry managed to find enough dry wood stored in the lean-to keep the fire going, and they pooled their food resources to make a simple but filling stew from dried meat, beans, and a few potatoes Henry had brought along. The close quarters forced a kind of intimacy neither had anticipated. As they sat at the small table sharing the stew from tin cups, there being only one bowl between them, Abigail found herself studying Henry more closely than propriety would normally allow. His hands were strong but capable of surprising gentleness, as she'd seen when he tended the horses. A small scar bisected his right eyebrow and another, fainter one curved along his jaw. His eyes, which she'd first thought were simply blue, revealed flecks of gray and even gold when caught in the right light. "You're staring," Henry observed, though he didn't seem offended. Abigail blushed. "Sorry, professional habit. I tend to notice details about people." "And what details have you noticed about me, Miss Turner?" There was a teasing quality to his voice that made her blush deepen. "That you've seen your share of fights, for one," she replied, gesturing to the scars on his face. "That you favor your right hand but can shoot equally well with your left. That despite your claim of being a simple ranch hand, you carry yourself like a man who's commanded others." Henry's eyebrows rose. "Observant indeed." He set down his cup. "And what conclusions have you drawn from these observations?" Abigail met his gaze directly. "That there's more to your story than you've shared, that you're running from something or someone, and that despite whatever's in your past, you're a good man at heart." A complicated expression crossed Henry's face: surprise, followed by something like sadness, then a reluctant smile. 2 out of 3 isn't bad. Which one did I get wrong? He looked down at his hands. I'm not running from anything, Abigail, not anymore. I've made my peace with my past. But I was right about the rest, Henry nodded slowly. Yes, though good man might be giving me too much credit. I don't think so, Abigail said quietly. A bad man wouldn't have stopped to help a woman he didn't know with nothing to gain from it. Perhaps I had something to gain, Henry suggested, his voice low. The company of a beautiful woman is nothing to dismiss lightly. The compliment caught her off guard, warming her cheeks again. No one had called her beautiful before. Pretty, perhaps, but never beautiful. Especially not in her current state, with her hair a tangled mess and her face scrubbed clean of any artifice. Now you're teasing me, she said, trying to keep her voice light. I'm not. Henry's eyes held hers, serious and sincere. You have a kind of beauty that has nothing to do with fancy dresses or painted faces. It comes from within, from your courage and your compassion. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with an energy Abigail had never experienced before. For a moment she thought Henry might reach across the table and take her hand. Instead, he cleared his throat and stood up. We should get some rest, he said, breaking the tension. Tomorrow will be a long day if we want to reach Coopersville by nightfall. Abigail nodded, not trusting her voice. As Henry prepared his makeshift bed on the floor, she settled onto the narrow cot, turning to face the wall to give him privacy. Outside, the rain continued to fall, a steady drumming that gradually lulled her toward sleep. Just before she drifted off, Abigail heard Henry's voice, so soft she almost thought she'd imagined it. You were right about one more thing, Abigail Turner. I was a soldier, yes, but after that, I wore a badge for several years. U.S. Marshal, based out of Denver. Abigail's eyes opened in the darkness. There was a long pause before Henry answered. That life is behind me now. I hung up the badge after. He trailed off. After what? Abigail asked gently. After I failed to protect someone who trusted me, he finally said, his voice hollow. Someone who died because of my mistake. Abigail rolled over to look at him, but in the dim light from the banked stove, she could only make out his silhouette. I'm sorry. It was 3 years ago, Henry said. Same fight where I got this bullet in my leg. Ambush meant for me killed my partner instead, young man with a wife and baby daughter. His voice tightened. I couldn't face them afterward, couldn't wear the badge knowing what it had cost them. It wasn't your fault, Abigail said softly. Ambushes, by their nature, are unexpected. I was the senior marshal. I should have been more careful, should have anticipated. No one can anticipate everything, Abigail interrupted. Not even the most experienced marshal or the most experienced doctor, she added, thinking of the patients she'd lost despite her best efforts. Henry was quiet for so long that Abigail thought he might have fallen asleep. Then, thank you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. It's been a long time since I talked about that day with anyone. Sometimes sharing a burden makes it lighter, Abigail replied. Is that why you told me about what happened in Caldwell? Abigail considered this. Perhaps, or perhaps I just knew you would understand. I do, Henry said, more than you know. The conversation faded into comfortable silence, and soon Abigail heard Henry's breathing deepen into sleep. She lay awake a while longer, thinking about the man on the floor just a few feet away, a former U.S. Marshal carrying his own weight of guilt and regret. A man who, despite his own troubles, had stopped to help her when no one else would. As sleep finally claimed her, Abigail realized that in just 2 days, Henry Stone had become more than a convenient traveling companion. He had become someone she was beginning to care about, perhaps more than was wise for a woman in her precarious position. The storm passed during the night, and they awoke to sunshine filtering through the cabin's single small window. After a quick breakfast of coffee and the last of their bread, they packed up and continued toward Coopersville. The rain had left the trail muddy but passable, and by mid-afternoon, the small settlement came into view in the valley below. Coopersville was larger than Abigail had expected, a proper town with several streets, a hotel, and businesses catering to the cattle and mining industries that sustained the region. As they rode down the main street, Abigail was acutely aware of curious eyes following them. "Word travels fast in territories like this," Henry murmured, riding close to her wagon. "Best if we present ourselves as brother and sister while we're here." Abigail nodded, understanding the necessity. An unmarried man and woman traveling together would invite speculation and possibly trouble. "Should I use your name or you mine? Stone is common enough," Henry replied. Miss Abigail Stone and her brother Henry, traveling to visit family in Montana. They secured rooms at the hotel adjacent but with a proper wall between them, much to Abigail's private relief. After 2 days on the trail, the prospect of a real bed and a hot bath was almost overwhelming. "I need to see about supplies," Henry said as they stood in the hotel lobby, "and perhaps inquire about work opportunities in the area. We'll need money if we're to continue north." Abigail's heart sank at the reminder of her situation. She had some savings, but not enough to establish herself somewhere new. She would need to find work, and soon. "I'll ask around about any need for medical services," she decided. "Even temporarily." Henry nodded. "We'll meet back here for supper at 6? "I'll be here," Abigail promised. After the luxury of a proper bath and changing into her one good dress, a modest blue calico saved for special occasions, Abigail ventured out to explore the town. She inquired at the general store about medical needs in the community and was directed to speak with a Mr. Whitman, who apparently served as the town's closest approximation to a doctor despite having no formal training. She found Mr. Whitman at a small office near the edge of town. He was an elderly man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, and hands gnarled with arthritis hands that would struggle with delicate procedures like stitching wounds or setting bones. "Miss Stone," he greeted her after she introduced herself and explained her situation, the edited version Henry had suggested. "A pleasure to meet a properly trained medical professional. I've done my best for this community, but I'm no doctor, just a former Army medic trying to fill the gap." "I understand completely, Mr. Whitman," Abigail said warmly. "In fact, I wonder if you might require assistance, even temporarily while I'm in town." The old man's face lit up. "Assistance? My dear, I'd be delighted to turn the whole practice over to younger, more capable hands." "These old fingers aren't what they used to be." Abigail blinked in surprise. "The whole practice, but I'm only passing through." "At my age, every day is a gift," Mr. Whitman said with a chuckle. "I've been praying for someone to take over so I could retire properly." "Stay a week or stay forever. I'd welcome the help for however long you can provide it." By the time Abigail met Henry for supper, she had spent 3 hours with Mr. Whitman, assessing his supplies, meeting a few patients, and discussing compensation for her assistance. The old medic was so grateful for her expertise that he'd offered her not only a generous daily wage, but also the use of the rooms behind his office for as long as she stayed. "It seems you've had a productive afternoon," Henry observed as they sat at a table in the hotel's small dining room. He looked different, freshly shaved, his clothes clean and pressed, his hair neatly combed. The transformation highlighted how handsome he truly was, and Abigail found herself momentarily flustered. "Very productive," she agreed, focusing on her plate. "Mr. Whitman has offered me work for as long as I wish to stay. He's been serving as the town's only medical practitioner, but his arthritis makes it difficult for him to continue." "That's fortunate," Henry said. "A town this size needs a proper doctor." "I'm not a doctor," Abigail reminded him, "just a woman trained by one." "From what I've seen, you're more qualified than most who claim the title," Henry replied. "Will you take the position?" Abigail sighed. "I told him I would stay at least a week. Beyond that, I don't know. What about you?" "Did you find work?" "The livery is hiring. Simple work, but it pays well enough." Henry took a sip of his coffee. "I thought I might stay a while too, at least until I'm certain you're settled safely." The notion that Henry was staying because of her brought a warmth to Abigail's chest that she tried to ignore. "You don't need to delay your journey on my account." "It's no delay," Henry assured her. "The ranch in Montana will still be there in a few weeks." "And besides," he added with a small smile, "I believe you mentioned something about properly treating my leg once we reached civilization." I did, Abigail acknowledged, automatically glancing at his injured limb. How is it feeling after yesterday's rain? Stiff, Henry admitted. Weather always makes it worse. Then it's settled, Abigail said decisively. You'll be my first official patient in Coopersville. They spent the rest of the meal discussing the town and its inhabitants, with Henry sharing observations he'd gathered during his own explorations that afternoon. There was an easy companionship between them now, the wariness of their first meeting replaced by growing trust and genuine enjoyment of each other's company. As they parted for the night in the hotel hallway, Abigail found herself reluctant to say goodnight. These past 3 days with Henry had been challenging, but also oddly freeing, the first time in her adult life she'd been truly on her own, making decisions without the weight of Caldwell's expectations pressing down on her. "Thank you," she said impulsively, "for everything you've done since we met." Henry's expression softened. "You'd have managed fine without me, Abigail Turner. You're stronger than you know." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but I'm glad I didn't have to find out alone." For a moment they stood looking at each other, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then Henry cleared his throat and stepped back. "Good night, Abigail. Sleep well." "Good night, Henry." As Abigail closed her door, she leaned against it, heart racing like a schoolgirl's. In just 3 days, this man had become important to her in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. The thought of him eventually continuing to Montana without her created an ache she hadn't anticipated, but that was a concern for another day. For now, she had a position to fill and a community to serve and a former U.S. Marshal's leg to properly heal. One step at a time, she told herself. Just one step at a time. The next morning, Abigail moved her belongings from the hotel to the rooms behind Mr. Whitman's office. The accommodations were simple but clean: a bedroom, a small sitting area with a stove for cooking, and a washroom. Most importantly, there was a separate entrance that would allow her to maintain privacy while still being accessible to patients in emergency situations. Mr. Whitman spent the day introducing her to his regular patients and showing her his system for record keeping and billing. By afternoon, word had spread through town that a new healer had arrived, and several curious townspeople stopped by under the pretense of minor ailments to assess her for themselves. Abigail treated each one with the same care and attention she'd given her patients in Caldwell, gradually winning over even the most skeptical. By the end of the day, she felt cautiously optimistic about her reception in Coopersville. Henry arrived as she was closing up for the evening, looking tired but satisfied after his own first day of work at the livery. "I brought supplies," he said, holding up a basket. "Thought you might be too busy to shop today." "That was thoughtful of you," Abigail said, genuinely touched. She led him through to her new living quarters. "It's not much, but it's clean and private." "It suits you," Henry observed, looking around the small rooms. "I can see you've already made it your own." It was true. She'd arranged her books on the single shelf, placed her mother's small hand mirror on the washstand, and set up her father's medical bag prominently on the table, ready for house calls. "Mr. Whitman is officially introducing me as the town's new medical practitioner at church on Sunday," she told Henry as she unpacked the food he'd brought: fresh bread, cheese, dried fruit, and even a small jar of honey. "He says once the minister gives his blessing, any remaining doubts about my abilities should fade." "Wise man," Henry commented. "Church approval goes a long way in small communities like this." Abigail set water to boil for tea, then turned to face Henry properly. "Speaking of my abilities, we should examine your leg again. I've restocked my supplies today, and Mr. Whitman has everything needed for the procedure we discussed." Henry hesitated. "Are you certain you want to take that on so soon? You've only just arrived." "There's no better way to prove my skills than to successfully treat a condition others have failed to resolve," Abigail pointed out pragmatically. "Besides, the sooner we address it, the sooner you'll be free of pain." After a simple meal shared at her small table, Abigail had Henry sit on the examination table in the office while she assessed his leg again. The rain had indeed aggravated the old injury. The area around the scar was warm to the touch and slightly swollen. The procedure isn't complex, she explained as she gently probed the damaged tissue. I'll reopen the wound, remove the scar tissue that's pressing on the nerve and stitch it properly. You'll need to stay off it completely for at least 3 days, then use crutches for another week or so. Where would I recuperate? Henry asked. The hotel isn't ideal for a lengthy recovery. Abigail had been considering this problem. Mr. Whitman suggested you could use the patient recovery room here. It's small but private with a proper bed. That way I could monitor your progress more easily. Henry's eyebrows rose slightly. That would certainly raise eyebrows in town, wouldn't it? An unmarried woman housing a man under her roof. You'd be a patient, not a boarder, Abigail replied, though she felt her cheeks warm at the implication. And Mr. Whitman would be here during the days, serving as a proper chaperone. If you're comfortable with the arrangement, then so am I, Henry decided. When would you want to perform this procedure? Tomorrow afternoon, Abigail said decisively. I'll speak with the livery owner in the morning to explain your absence. Henry nodded, then winced as she hit a particularly tender spot. Sorry, she murmured. It's fine, he assured her, though his jaw was tight with pain. I trust you, Abigail. Those simple words affected her more deeply than she expected. Trust was precious in the wild territories, not given lightly or quickly. That Henry would place such faith in her skills after knowing her for such a short time felt significant. I won't let you down, she promised softly. Their eyes met and held for a long moment. Then, moving with careful deliberation, Henry reached out and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused against her skin, his grip gentle but secure. I know you won't, he said, his voice low. Abigail's heart quickened, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed her fingers to curl around his, accepting the connection he offered. They stayed like that for several heartbeats, hands clasped, eyes locked, the air between them charged with possibility. Finally, reluctantly, Abigail withdrew her hand. You should get some rest before tomorrow, she said, her voice not quite steady, and so should I. Henry studied her face for a moment longer, then nodded. Until tomorrow, then. After he left, Abigail found herself touching the hand he had held, the sensation of his skin against hers still vivid in her memory. She was walking a dangerous path, she knew. Developing feelings for a man who was essentially passing through her life was unwise at best, heartbreaking at worst. And yet, as she prepared for bed that night, Abigail couldn't help but wonder if perhaps Henry Stone had come into her life at precisely the moment she needed him, not just as a protector on the trail, but as a reminder that there could be more to her future than the limited prospects she'd envisioned in Caldwell. The next afternoon, with Mr. Whitman assisting, Abigail successfully performed the procedure on Henry's leg. He had refused anything stronger than whiskey for the pain, insisting he needed to remain alert, but he hadn't made a sound throughout the delicate operation beyond a sharp intake of breath when she first cut into the scar tissue. There, she said finally, tying off the last stitch. It's done. The nerve should be free now, and with proper healing, the pain should diminish significantly. Thank you, Henry said, his face pale but composed. Both of you. Mr. Whitman patted Henry's shoulder. Remarkable work, Miss Turner. I've never seen such precise technique. Your father taught you well. Abigail smiled at the compliment as she bandaged Henry's leg. He was a gifted surgeon. I wish I had even half his skill. You're being modest, Henry said. I've been treated by army surgeons who weren't half as careful or thorough. Once the procedure was complete, they helped Henry to the recovery room, a small chamber with a narrow bed, a chair, and a small table. It was basic but clean, and most importantly, adjacent to Abigail's quarters, so she could easily check on him throughout his recovery. You'll need to keep the leg elevated, she instructed as they settled him on the bed, and I'll need to change the bandages twice daily to prevent infection. I'll leave you to get your patient settled, Mr. Whitman said with a knowing smile that made Abigail blush. I'm closing up for the day, but ring the bell if you need anything. Once they were alone, Henry sighed and leaned back against the pillows. I feel like I've been kicked by a mule. The pain will ease once the whiskey wears off, Abigail assured him, arranging a pillow under his leg. I can give you laudanum if it becomes unbearable, Henry shook his head. No laudanum. I've seen too many men develop a dependence on it after injuries. I'll manage with whiskey if needed. Abigail nodded, respecting his decision. Rest now, I'll bring you some broth later. As she turned to leave, Henry caught her wrist gently. Abigail, his voice was soft but steady. Thank you not just for this, but for believing you could fix what others couldn't. The simple sincerity in his eyes made her throat tight with emotion. That's what healing is about, she said. Believing recovery is possible, even when others have given up hope. Henry's fingers lingered on her wrist for a moment longer, his thumb brushing lightly over her pulse point before he released her. You're quite extraordinary, Abigail Turner. She left the room with her cheeks flushed and her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. This growing attraction between them was becoming harder to ignore, but she reminded herself sternly that Henry would eventually continue his journey north. Getting too attached would only lead to heartache. The next few days fell into a rhythm as Abigail divided her time between treating patients, learning the town's medical needs from Mr. Whitman, and caring for Henry. His recovery progressed well, with no signs of infection, and by the third day he was already asking about crutches so he could move around more freely. Patience, Abigail admonished as she changed his bandages. Rush this healing and you'll undo all our hard work. I'm not good at sitting idle, Henry admitted with a rueful smile, so I've noticed. Abigail finished securing the fresh bandage. Perhaps you could occupy yourself with something constructive. Mr. Whitman mentioned you've been helping with the bookkeeping, Henry nodded. I offered when I saw him struggling with the ledgers yesterday. Numbers come easily to me. Another hidden talent, Abigail observed. Former U.S. Marshal, ranch hand, and now bookkeeper. Is there anything you don't do well, Mr. Stone? Patience, apparently, Henry replied, making her laugh. Then more seriously, how are you settling in? The town treating you well? Better than I expected, Abigail said, sitting in the chair beside his bed. Everyone's been kind, if a bit reserved. Sunday's church service helped Reverend Phillips made quite a point of welcoming me and emphasizing my medical training. And no one's asked why you left your previous position, Abigail sighed. A few have hinted at it. I've simply said there was a disagreement with the town council over my professional obligations. It's vague enough without being dishonest. Henry studied her face. Does it bother you not telling the whole truth? Sometimes, she admitted. But I'm afraid if they knew I'd treated an outlaw, they might react the same way Caldwell did. And I can't risk being driven out again, not when I'm just starting to build something here. For what it's worth, Henry said quietly, I think you did the right thing. Both in treating Blackwater and in how you're handling it now. His support meant more to her than she could express. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the outer door, a patient arriving. I should go, she said, rising. Mr. Whitman's gone to visit his daughter in the next town over, so I'm handling all calls today. Go, Henry urged. I'm fine here with my ledgers and my thoughts. The patient turned out to be Mrs. Holloway, the innkeeper's wife, suffering from a persistent cough. Abigail prescribed a syrup of wild cherry bark and honey, along with instructions to inhale steam with a few drops of eucalyptus oil. As Mrs. Holloway prepared to leave, she paused at the door. I heard you have a gentleman staying in your recovery room, Miss Turner. Abigail kept her expression neutral. Yes, a patient who required surgery on an old injury. He's recovering well. Your brother, some are saying. Mrs. Holloway's tone made it clear she had her doubts. Mr. Stone was kind enough to escort me here from Wyoming after my departure from my previous position, Abigail said carefully. We are not related by blood, but he has been as protective as any brother might be. Mrs. Holloway studied her for a moment, then nodded. Well, it's good you weren't traveling alone. Too many dangers for a woman on the trail these days. She lowered her voice. Speaking of dangers, there's been talk of riders asking questions about a woman matching your description over in Millerville. Just thought you should know. Abigail's blood ran cold. Millerville was less than a day's ride from Coopersville. What kind of riders? 3 men, well armed. One wore a badge, sheriff or deputy, not sure which. They were asking about a young woman healer traveling alone or with a single male companion. Mrs. Holloway patted Abigail's hand. Probably nothing to do with you, dear, but thought you should be aware. Folks around here mind their business, but strangers asking questions tend to get noticed. After Mrs. Holloway left, Abigail leaned against the closed door, her heart racing. Could the sheriff from Caldwell have actually pursued her? Banishment wasn't enough. Was he now trying to bring her back to face further consequences? Or perhaps press charges for aiding a known criminal? Abigail, Henry's voice called from the recovery room. Everything all right? She composed herself before going to him, but something in her face must have betrayed her distress. What happened? Henry asked immediately, trying to sit up straighter. Abigail related what Mrs. Holloway had told her, watching as Henry's expression darkened. Sheriff Mills, he muttered. Man always did have more pride than sense. You know him? Abigail asked, surprised. Henry hesitated, then nodded. Not personally, but by reputation. He was a deputy in Denver for a while before taking the sheriff's position in Caldwell. Has a habit of holding grudges. What should I do? Abigail asked, hating the tremor in her voice. I can't keep running every time someone from my past appears. Henry's jaw set in a determined line. You won't run. This is where you've chosen to start over, and this is where you'll stay. His eyes met hers, steely with resolve. If Mills or his deputies show up here looking for trouble, they'll have to go through me first. You're injured, Abigail reminded him, though his protectiveness made her heart swell. I've faced worse odds with worse injuries, Henry replied. Then, more gently, but hopefully it won't come to that. Let's not borrow trouble before it arrives. Despite his reassurance, they both knew that trouble might indeed be heading their way. That night, after checking on Henry one last time, Abigail lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to every creak and rustle outside her window. She had finally found a place where she might belong, where her skills were valued and her past mistakes unknown. The thought of losing it all again filled her with a cold dread that made sleep impossible. Around midnight, unable to rest, Abigail rose and quietly made her way to the recovery room. To her surprise, Henry was also awake, sitting up in bed with a book open on his lap. Couldn't sleep either. He asked softly as she entered. Abigail shook her head. Too many thoughts. Without a word, Henry shifted to make space on the edge of the narrow bed and patted it in invitation. Abigail hesitated only briefly before sitting beside him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. Tell me about your home, Henry said unexpectedly. Your real home before Caldwell? Abigail blinked in surprise. How did you know Caldwell wasn't my real home, the way you talk about it? Henry replied. There's no fondness there, just duty. Where were you born? Grateful for the distraction, Abigail let herself remember. Virginia, a small town near Richmond. My father was the local doctor there until the war broke out. We left when I was 12 after my mother died and the fighting came too close. So you've known displacement before, Henry observed. Yes, though differently. We chose to leave Virginia. We weren't forced out. Abigail sighed. Father never really settled again after that. We moved from place to place throughout the war, him offering his services wherever they were needed. Caldwell was just where we happened to be when he decided he was too tired to keep moving. And you stayed after he passed because it was finally a place to call home, Henry guessed. Exactly. Abigail's voice softened with realization, but it never really was home, was it? Not if they could turn on me so quickly. Henry's hand found hers in the dim light, fingers intertwining naturally. Home isn't always a place, Abigail. Sometimes it's a purpose. Sometimes it's a person. His words resonated deep within her, stirring emotions she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge fully. She looked up to find Henry watching her, his eyes intent and searching in the lamplight. I'm beginning to understand that, she whispered. The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken feelings. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Henry leaned forward and pressed his lips gently against hers. The kiss was brief and tender, a question more than a demand. When he pulled back, Abigail remained still, her eyes closed, savoring the sensation of his lips on hers, the first kiss she'd ever received. I shouldn't have done that, Henry murmured, though he didn't sound particularly remorseful. No, you shouldn't have, Abigail agreed, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. But I'm glad you did. A smile curved Henry's mouth. Even knowing I'll be leaving eventually, the reminder stung, but Abigail refused to let it diminish this moment. Even knowing that, she confirmed. Some experiences are worth having, regardless of how they end. Henry's expression turned serious. What if I said I'm reconsidering my plans, that Montana doesn't hold the same appeal it once did? Abigail's heart quickened. I'd say that's a conversation for when you're fully recovered and thinking clearly, she replied, though hope bloomed in her chest. Henry chuckled. Always the practical healer. He squeezed her hand. Get some rest, Abigail. Whatever comes tomorrow, we'll face it together. Somewhat reluctantly, Abigail rose and returned to her own room, her mind and heart full. The specter of Sheriff Mills and his deputies still loomed, but somehow knowing Henry would stand with her made the threat seem less overwhelming. As she finally drifted towards sleep, Abigail realized that for the first time since leaving Caldwell, she wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. Whatever happened, she would face it with courage, and she wouldn't face it alone. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with no sign of trouble on the horizon. Abigail attended to her regular patients, checked on Henry, who was already up and attempting to move around on the crutches Mr. Whitman had procured for him, and even found time to bake bread in the small oven behind the office. It was late afternoon when the sound of horses outside the office drew her attention. 3 riders, dust-covered and grim-faced, dismounted in front of the building. Through the window, Abigail recognized Sheriff Mills immediately, his star gleaming on his chest as he hitched his horse to the post. Henry had heard them too. He appeared in the doorway of the recovery room, balanced on his crutches, his face set in determined lines. Stay inside, Abigail told him firmly. This is my fight. Not anymore, Henry replied, his voice leaving no room for argument. Not since Caldwell. Before she could protest further, the office door opened and Sheriff Mills stepped inside, flanked by 2 deputies Abigail vaguely recognized from Caldwell. The sheriff's eyes widened slightly when he saw her, then narrowed as they shifted to Henry. Miss Turner, Mills said coldly. Fancy finding you here playing doctor again. I'm not playing, Sheriff, Abigail replied, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. I'm practicing medicine as I was trained to do, Mills snorted, without license or authority, just like in Caldwell. He turned to his deputies. Search the place. See if Blackwater's here or if there's any sign he's been treated recently. You have no jurisdiction here, Mills, Henry spoke up, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority that made the deputies hesitate. The sheriff's eyes narrowed as he took in Henry more fully. Do I know you? Name's Henry Stone, former U.S. Marshal out of the Denver office. Henry shifted on his crutches, wincing slightly as he put weight on his injured leg, and Miss Turner is under my protection. A flash of recognition crossed Mills's face, followed quickly by wariness. Stone. I heard you retired after that mess on the Smoky Hill Trail. I laid down the badge, Henry corrected him. Not the oath I took to uphold justice and protect the innocent. Mills's face reddened. This woman harbored a known criminal, a murderer. There's nothing innocent about that. She treated an injured man as her medical oath required, Henry replied. There's a difference between harboring a criminal and fulfilling a healer's duty. The sheriff took a menacing step forward. She let him go. He killed again 2 counties over, not 3 days after she patched him up. That blood is on her hands. Abigail felt the color drain from her face. What? Stage robbery near Granite Pass, one of the deputies supplied. Driver and a passenger killed. Witnesses identified Blackwater. The news hit Abigail like a physical blow. 2 more deaths so soon after she'd saved the man responsible. Had Sheriff Mills been right all along? Should she have let Blackwater die on her doorstep? Henry must have seen the doubt in her eyes because he moved closer to her, his presence solid and reassuring. You didn't pull the trigger, Abigail. You didn't plan the robbery. You did what any decent healer would do. You saved a life. What Blackwater did afterward is on him, not you, Mills scoffed. Pretty words, Stone, but the Council of Caldwell saw it differently. They banished her for a reason. Then they were wrong, Henry said flatly. And if you've come to drag her back, you'll have to go through me first. The declaration hung in the air, charged with tension. Mills's hand hovered near his gun, and his deputies shifted nervously. You draw on a lawman's stone, Mills challenged. That's not the oath you took. I swore to protect the innocent, Henry repeated steadily, and I'm looking at the most innocent person in this room. The standoff might have escalated further if not for the timely arrival of Coopersville's own sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Riker who entered the office with a thunderous expression. "What's going on here, Mills?" he demanded. "You didn't bother to check in with me before conducting business in my town." Mills straightened defensively. "Following a lead on the Blackwater case, this woman, Miss Turner, is our town's medical practitioner," Sheriff Riker interrupted. "Highly respected and welcomed by the community, including our minister and town council." His eyes narrowed. "And you're on my territory without so much as a courtesy call. That's not how things are done between lawmen, and you know it." The reprimand seemed to take some of the wind out of Mills's sails. "Blackwater killed 2 more people," he said stubbornly, "and she helped him." "From what I heard," Riker replied, "she treated his wounds as any doctor would be obligated to do." "If you have evidence she actively assisted him in evading capture or committing crimes, present it now." Mills's mouth worked, but no such evidence was forthcoming. "That's what I thought," Riker said. "Now, I suggest you and your deputies head back to Caldwell. Miss Turner is a citizen of Coopersville now, under my jurisdiction and my protection." He paused meaningfully. "And from the looks of it, under Marshal Stone's protection as well." "Former marshal," Henry corrected quietly. "Once a marshal, always a marshal in my book," Riker replied with a respectful nod. Outmaneuvered and outnumbered, Sheriff Mills had little choice but to retreat. But at the door he turned back, his eyes cold as they fixed on Abigail. "2 more dead," he said. "Remember that when you lay your head down tonight." After they departed, Sheriff Riker apologized to Abigail for the intrusion. "Mrs. Holloway mentioned they might be headed this way. Thought I'd better step in before things got ugly." He tipped his hat to her, then to Henry. "Marshal Stone, good to have someone of your experience in town, even temporarily." Once they were alone again, the weight of Mills's accusations came crashing down on Abigail. She sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "2 more people," she whispered. "Dead because I saved him." Henry set aside his crutches and lowered himself carefully to kneel before her, taking her hands in his despite the pain it must have caused his injured leg. "Look at me, Abigail," he said firmly. "Look at me." She raised her eyes to his, seeing nothing but conviction in his steady gaze. "You did not kill those people," he said, each word clear and deliberate. "Joe Blackwater did. You made a choice to honor your oath as a healer, the same choice any doctor with integrity would make. The same choice your father would have made. But if I had let him die, then you would have betrayed everything you believe in," Henry interrupted gently. "And those 2 people might still be alive, yes, or Blackwater might have killed 2 different people in a different robbery. Or someone else entirely might have robbed that stage. We can't know, Abigail. All we can do is make the best choices we can with the information we have at the time." His words slowly penetrated the fog of guilt and doubt that had enveloped her. Abigail drew a deep breath, then another, feeling her composure gradually return. "You stood up for me," she said quietly. "Against a lawman, that couldn't have been easy for you." "Easier than you might think," Henry replied with a small smile. "Mills may wear a badge, but that doesn't make him right. And standing between you and those who would harm you is the easiest decision I've ever made." The simple declaration, spoken with such certainty, moved Abigail deeply. Without overthinking it, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a gentle kiss, a mirror of the one they had shared the night before. When they parted, Henry's eyes were warm with an emotion Abigail was only beginning to recognize. "What was that for?" "For believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself," she replied. "And for standing between me and them, just like you promised you would." Henry's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch tender. "I meant every word, Abigail, and I'll keep meaning them for as long as you'll let me stay." The promise in his voice was unmistakable. And for the first time since leaving Caldwell, Abigail allowed herself to truly hope for a future that included more than mere survival, a future that might include the remarkable man before her, whose own broken places seemed to fit so perfectly with hers. Over the next few weeks, Henry's leg healed steadily under Abigail's careful attention. True to her prediction, the pain began to diminish once the scar tissue was properly addressed, and by the end of the third week, he was walking with only a slight limp and no need for crutches. During this time, their relationship deepened beyond the tentative beginnings they had established. Henry continued to stay in the recovery room, helping with the practices, bookkeeping, and making small repairs around the building that Mr. Whitman had neglected. His presence became so natural that neither gave much thought to the arrangement's propriety, though they were careful to maintain appropriate boundaries, especially when patients were present. Coopersville, for its part, seemed to accept them as a pair without much comment. Perhaps Sheriff Riker had shared something of their confrontation with Mills, or perhaps the town simply recognized the genuine affection between them. Whatever the reason, Abigail found herself welcomed into the community in a way she had never experienced in Caldwell. As Henry's recovery progressed, however, the question of his eventual departure loomed larger. His original plan to continue north to Montana remained unmentioned between them, though Abigail noticed he no longer spoke of the ranch that had been his destination. One evening, as they sat on the small porch behind the office enjoying the sunset, Abigail finally found the courage to broach the subject. "Your leg seems fully healed now," she observed, watching as Henry stretched it out comfortably before him. "You could travel without difficulty." Henry's eyes remained on the horizon, where the fading light painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. "I could," he agreed neutrally. "The ranch in Montana," Abigail continued carefully, "will they still have a position for you?" Now Henry turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. "I received a letter from the owner last week. They've filled the position I was interested in." "Oh." Abigail wasn't sure if she should feel relieved or concerned. "I'm sorry to hear that." "I'm not," Henry said simply. "I've been thinking I might stay in Coopersville." Sheriff Riker mentioned he could use a deputy with experience. Hope fluttered in Abigail's chest, but she kept her voice measured. "You'd consider wearing a badge again after what happened with your partner?" Henry was quiet for a moment. "I've carried that guilt for 3 years, Abigail. Used it as an excuse to drift, to avoid putting down roots or taking on responsibilities that might lead to more loss." He reached over and took her hand. "But someone very wise recently reminded me that we can only make the best choices we can with the information we have at the time." Abigail smiled, recognizing her own words. "And you've decided that taking the deputy position is the best choice now?" "No," Henry said, surprising her. "I've decided that staying near you is the best choice. The deputy position is just a means to that end." The directness of his declaration took her breath away. "Henry, I love you, Abigail Turner," he said simply. "I think I started falling in love with you the moment you pointed that rifle at me outside Caldwell. Your courage, your compassion, your unwavering commitment to doing what's right, how could I not love you?" Tears blurred Abigail's vision as emotions washed over her joy, relief, and a profound gratitude that this man had ridden into her life at her darkest moment. "I love you too," she whispered, the words coming easily now that they had been offered first. "I tried not to. I told myself it was foolish to grow attached to someone who would eventually leave, but it happened anyway." Henry's smile was radiant as he leaned in to kiss her, not the hesitant, gentle kisses they had shared before, but a kiss filled with promise and certainty. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I'm not leaving," he murmured. "Not unless you're coming with me." "I have a practice here now," Abigail reminded him. "People who depend on me." "Then we'll stay," Henry said, as if it were the simplest decision in the world. "Build a life here together." "People will talk," Abigail pointed out, though she couldn't bring herself to care much about that prospect. Henry chuckled. "People already talk. Mrs. Holloway has been planning our wedding since the day I moved into the recovery room." "Wedding?" Abigail pulled back slightly to see his face. "Are you proposing, Mr. Stone?" "Not yet," Henry replied with a mischievous glint in his eye. When I do, you'll know it. It will involve a ring, perhaps some flowers, and definitely not a conversation about town gossip. Abigail laughed, happiness bubbling up inside her like a spring. Fair enough. They sat together as twilight deepened into night, hands entwined, hearts aligned, the future stretching before them like an open trail not without its challenges, but rich with possibility. 3 days later, Henry did propose, with a simple gold band he'd purchased from the jeweler in town and a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked himself. They were married by Reverend Phillips in the small church on a sunny Saturday afternoon, with what seemed like the entire population of Coopersville in attendance. Mr. Whitman gave away the bride, beaming with paternal pride. Sheriff Riker stood as Henry's best man, having officially deputized him the day before. And Mrs. Holloway outdid herself preparing a reception feast that the town would talk about for years to come. As Abigail and Henry Stone exchanged their vows, she reflected on the strange, winding path that had led her here. The banishment that had seemed like an ending had, in fact, been a beginning. The darkest moment of her life had led directly to finding the love and acceptance she had always sought. Life in Coopersville proved to be everything Caldwell had not. With Henry as deputy and Abigail as the town's healer, they quickly became central figures in the community. They purchased a small house near the edge of town, with enough land for Abigail to grow medicinal herbs and for Henry to keep a few horses. The practice flourished as Abigail's reputation spread throughout the region. People came from neighboring settlements seeking her care, sometimes traveling days to consult the healing woman of Coopersville. Mr. Whitman officially retired but remained a cherished mentor and friend, often stopping by to assist with particularly interesting cases or simply to share a cup of coffee and medical observations. Henry thrived in his role as deputy, his natural authority and fairness earning him the respect of even the most troublesome elements in town. The nightmares about his former partner gradually subsided as he found purpose in protecting his new community and building a life with Abigail. A year after their wedding, they received a surprising visitor, Joe Blackwater himself, now reformed and working as a scout for the Army. He had come specifically to thank Abigail for saving his life, and to assure her that the stage robbery near Granite Pass had been the work of impersonators using his reputation to cover their tracks. The real Blackwater had been in a mission hospital at the time, having decided to turn his life around after the kindness she had shown him. The news lifted a weight from Abigail's heart that she hadn't fully acknowledged was still there. When she wrote to inform the Council of Caldwell about this development, she received a letter of apology from Reverend Thomas, though not from Mayor Wilson or Sheriff Mills. It was enough for Abigail to finally close that chapter of her life without bitterness. 2 years into their marriage, Abigail and Henry welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Grace, after Abigail's mother. She was born healthy and strong, with her father's striking silver-blue eyes and her mother's determination. As Abigail watched Henry cradling their newborn daughter, tears of joy tracking unashamedly down his face, she thought of how differently her life might have turned out had she not opened her door to a wounded outlaw that night in Caldwell. "What are you thinking about?" Henry asked, looking up to find her watching them with a soft smile. "How sometimes the hardest choices lead to the greatest blessings," she replied, "and how grateful I am that you rode into my life when you did." Henry carefully rose from his chair and came to sit beside her on the bed, their daughter sleeping peacefully in his arms. "I think about that too," he admitted. "How close I came to riding past Caldwell entirely, how many small decisions led us both to that exact moment." Abigail reached out to stroke their daughter's downy head. "Do you ever regret it, standing between me and them, tying your fate to mine?" "Never," Henry said without hesitation. "Not for a single moment." He leaned over to kiss her gently. "You saved me just as surely as you saved Blackwater that night. I was drifting, haunted by the past. You gave me purpose again, a home. And you gave me courage when I needed it most. Abigail replied, reminded me that standing by my convictions was worth whatever came after. As Grace stirred in her father's arms, making the tiny snuffling sounds that both parents already found endlessly fascinating, Abigail reflected on how complete her life had become. She had her healing work, a community that valued her, a husband who loved her completely, and now this perfect child to raise together. "I love you, Henry Stone," she whispered, leaning against his shoulder. "And I love you, Abigail Stone," he replied, his voice rich with contentment. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days after that." The small family sat together in the golden afternoon light, their future stretching before them like the vast Wyoming horizon full of promise, opportunity, and the deep, abiding love that had begun with a simple act of courage and the words that would forever define their story. "Then I'll stand between you and them." Epilogue. 15 years later, the graduation ceremony at Denver's Medical College was drawing to a close as the dean called the final name. Grace Stone. Abigail clutched Henry's hand tightly as their daughter stepped forward to receive her medical certificate, the youngest woman in her class and one of only 3 female graduates that year. At 17, Grace had her father's height and her mother's steady hands, a combination that had served her well during her accelerated studies. "She did it," Abigail whispered, tears of pride blurring her vision, the youngest licensed doctor in Colorado Territory. Henry squeezed her hand, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Never doubted it for a moment," he replied. "She's your daughter, after all." Beside them, their 12-year-old twins, James and Elizabeth, fidgeted in their formal clothes but clapped enthusiastically for their big sister. And next to them, Mr. Whitman, now well into his 80s but still sharp-minded, dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief. "3 generations of healers," the old man murmured. "Your father would be so proud, Abigail." After the ceremony, the family gathered around Grace, showering her with congratulations and hugs. She had grown into a remarkable young woman, brilliant, compassionate, and possessing her parents' unwavering moral compass. "So, Dr. Stone," Henry said with a proud smile, "what's next for you?" Grace's eyes shone with excitement. "Professor Werner has recommended me for a position at the new women's hospital in San Francisco. They're doing groundbreaking work there." Abigail felt a pang at the thought of her daughter moving so far away, but pride quickly overshadowed it. "You'll be wonderful there," she said sincerely, "though Coopersville won't be the same without you." "I'm only going for a year or 2, Grace assured them. "Then I'm coming home to join your practice, Mother. Someone has to look after Coopersville when you and Father finally decide to retire." Henry laughed. "Your mother retire? I'll believe that when I see it." It was true that at 47, Abigail showed no signs of slowing down. Her practice had expanded to include a proper small hospital that served the entire county, and her reputation had grown to the point that doctors from as far away as Chicago occasionally consulted her on difficult cases. Henry, at 53, had eventually succeeded Sheriff Riker and now served as Coopersville's respected sheriff. His hair had silvered at the temples and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but he remained as steadfast and principled as the day Abigail had first met him. Together, they had built not just a life, but a legacy, one that would continue through their children and the community they had helped to shape. That evening, after the twins had gone to bed and Grace was spending a last night with her school friends before they all went their separate ways, Abigail and Henry sat on the porch of their home, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if they hadn't banished me from Caldwell?" Abigail asked, voicing a thought that occasionally still crossed her mind. "If I'd stayed there," continued my father's practice. Henry considered this, his arm warm around her shoulders. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "I might have passed through, perhaps stopped for supplies. We might have exchanged pleasantries and gone our separate ways, never knowing what we could have been to each other. Or you might have gotten into trouble and ended up on my doorstep needing medical attention," Abigail suggested with a smile. "That's more likely," Henry agreed with a chuckle. "Given my talent for finding trouble back then, I'm glad it happened the way it did. Abigail said after a moment. Not the pain or the loss, but the journey that brought us together. I wouldn't trade this life for any other. Henry turned to look at her, his eyes still capable of making her heart skip after all these years. Nor would I. You and our children are the best things that ever happened to me, Abigail Stone. As they sat together beneath the vast Wyoming sky, Abigail reflected on the extraordinary path her life had taken. From a young woman cast out by her community to a respected healer, beloved wife, and proud mother. All because she had refused to compromise her principles, and because a former marshal with his own wounded past had decided to stand between her and those who would harm her. I love you, Henry, she said simply, resting her head against his shoulder. And I love you, Abigail, he replied, his voice as sure and steady as it had been on their wedding day. Today, tomorrow, and all the days after that. The promise, renewed daily for 15 years, remained as true and unshakable as the mountains that stood sentinel on the horizon. Whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, just as they always had, with courage, conviction, and the deep, abiding love that had begun on a dark night outside Caldwell all those years ago.